The air in the infirmary is a tight, thin blanket of carbolic acid, dust, and fear. Alara Finch moves through it, her nurse's uniform a stark white ghost against the rough-hewn timber walls of Fort Grant. Her patient, a man the soldiers dragged in like a slaughtered wolf, lies on the cot, his breathing a ragged whisper of sound. He is Apache, his body a canvas of muscle and old scars now marred by the fresh, brutal work of a cavalry bullet. They call him a savage, a murderer, a menace to be eradicated. In the flickering lamplight, as she cleans the weeping wound in his side, Alara sees only a man in agonizing pain. His silence is a thing of stone, a fortress more imposing than the fort's own palisade walls. He has not made a sound since they brought him in, save for the labor of his lungs. But his eyes, dark and deep-set beneath a proud brow, follow her every move. They are not vacant with pain. They are sharp, intelligent, and wary. He is her prisoner as much as he is her patient, a reality underscored by the guard posted outside her door. For hours, she has worked to stem the bleeding, to clean the wound, to fight the fever that has begun to slick his skin with a dangerous sheen. He has borne it all with an unnerving stillness. Now, in the deep well of the night, a change occurs. He stirs, his hand moving with painful slowness from his side. Alara tenses, her training warring with a primal instinct of fear. He is a warrior, even wounded, but he does not reach for her. He reaches inside the tattered remnant of his buckskin leggings. His fingers withdraw, holding a single arrow. It is his last. She had seen the soldiers snap his bow and toss his empty quiver onto the fire like a piece of trash. The arrow is a simple, deadly thing of wood and stone and feather. He extends his hand, not in threat, but as an offering. His dark eyes lock onto hers, and in their depths, she sees a flicker of something beyond pain or suspicion. It is a plea, a transference, a final, desperate act of trust. Slowly, her own hand trembling, she reaches out and takes it. The fletching is soft against her palm, the obsidian arrowhead cool and lethally sharp. He gives a faint, almost imperceptible nod, and his hand falls back to his side, his eyes closing. In that single, silent gesture, a pact is made in a language older than words. He has given her his last weapon, his last piece of himself. He has trusted the enemy. And as Alara stands there, clutching the arrow, the first pale fingers of dawn begin to stain the eastern sky. The quiet of the night is shattered by the sound of heavy boots on the hard-packed earth and a sharp, authoritative voice. By sunrise, the cavalry has blocked the gate to her infirmary. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. Then shift to past tense for the main body of the story. The arrow felt alien in Alara's hand, a relic from a world she was paid to help conquer. It was a thing of elegant lethality, its shaft smooth and stained with ochre, its fletching made from the feathers of a hawk, bound with sinew so fine it was nearly invisible. The weight of it was nothing, yet it felt heavier than any medical instrument she had ever held. It was the weight of a man's last stand, his final defiance, and he had placed it in her keeping. Outside, the voice grew louder, laced with an impatience that grated on her already frayed nerves. It was Captain Thorne. Alara had been at Fort Grant for 6 months, long enough to understand its harsh calculus. It was an island of canvas tents and raw timber in a sea of red rock and unforgiving sun. It existed for one purpose: to pacify the territory, a clinical term for hunting and killing the Apache who had lived on this land for centuries. She had come west from Philadelphia, seeking not adventure, but escape. Escape from a life that had been laid out for her like a formal dinner setting. A suitable marriage, a quiet home, a slow, predictable fading into obscurity. She had wanted purpose, a place where her skills as a nurse, honed in the crowded, disease-ridden wards of the city hospital, would mean something more than comforting the dying rich. She had found purpose, but she had not found peace. The men of the fort treated her with a clumsy, often unwelcome reverence, a mixture of awe for her medical knowledge and a crude possessiveness of her as one of the few white women for 100 miles. She was our nurse, the angel of the fort, titles that felt less like compliments and more like brands. The fort's commander, Colonel Wallace, was a weary, by-the-book administrator who saw her presence as a necessary, if complicated, component of morale. But the fort's true heart, its driving, aggressive pulse, was Captain Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mesas. He was ambitious, cruel, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He saw the Apache not as a people, but as an infestation to be cleared. He led the patrols, he directed the skirmishes, and he reveled in the grim trophies of his work. It was his patrol that had brought the wounded warrior in, a prize he seemed to cherish more than a captured guidon. He had wanted to leave the man to die where he fell, but Colonel Wallace, ever mindful of regulations that might come back to haunt him, had insisted the prisoner be treated. "A live prisoner might talk, Captain," Wallace had said, his voice dry as dust. "A dead one is just carrion." So they had brought him to Alara, dumping him on her cot with the same care they might afford a sack of grain. "Patch him up, nurse," Thorne had ordered, his smile a thin, unpleasant line. Just enough so he can feel the rope. All through the long night, that sentiment had echoed in the quiet infirmary. It was a place of healing, her sanctuary, but it had been violated by the hatred that festered outside its walls. As she had worked, she had found herself studying the man on the cot, searching for the monster Thorne described. She saw none. She saw the powerful lines of his body, the way his muscles corded even in repose. She saw the intricate patterns of small, white scars that told a story of a life lived hard and close to the bone. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, a pain he refused to voice. And most of all, she saw his eyes. When he had first woken under her care, his eyes had been filled with a pure, undiluted hatred that had made her hand falter. He saw her uniform, her white skin, and he saw the enemy. She had met his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral, and had simply continued her work, her movements gentle but efficient. She had offered him water from a dipper. He had turned his head away, his jaw clenched. She had not insisted, simply leaving the dipper beside the cot. An hour later, when she returned, the water was gone. It was the first concession, a silent acknowledgement of a shared humanity, however fragile. The night wore on, a long, slow battle against the infection that threatened to consume him. She bathed his face with a cool cloth, and for a moment, his stony facade had cracked. A low sound, a word in a language she did not understand, escaped his lips. His brow furrowed, not in anger, but in some fevered dream of a place far from this wooden cage. In that moment, he was not a warrior, not a prisoner, but simply a man, lost and in pain. It was then that her professional detachment had irrevocably fractured, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct. He was her patient, and she would not let Thorne have him. Now, with the arrow in her hand and the captain's boots crunching outside, that resolve was being put to the ultimate test. The door to the infirmary swung open without a knock, crashing against the interior wall. Captain Thorne filled the doorway, flanked by 2 armed troopers. His eyes, the color of a pale winter sky, swept the room, lingering on the empty dipper, then on Alara, and finally fixing on the man on the cot. "Morning, nurse," Thorne said, his voice slick with false courtesy. "I trust you've had a productive night. Is our guest ready for a little chat?" Alara positioned herself deliberately between Thorne and the cot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence. She tightened her grip on the arrow, its sharp point digging into her palm. "He is in no condition to be moved or interrogated, Captain. He has a severe fever, and the wound is dangerously infected. Any undue stress could kill him." Thorne chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. He took a step into the room, and the small space seemed to shrink, charged with his aggressive energy. "Death is a likely outcome for him one way or another, Miss Finch. I just prefer he be useful before it happens. He was with the band that raided the Bar J Ranch. I want to know where they're holed up. And I am telling you, as the ranking medical authority in this fort, that your interrogation will have to wait, Alara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She was channeling every ounce of the authority her father, a renowned Philadelphia surgeon, had wielded like a scepter. Thorne's smile vanished. His gaze dropped to her hand, and his eyes narrowed as he saw the arrow. What is this? Did he threaten you? He reached for his sidearm. No, Alara said quickly, moving her hand behind her back. He did not. He is delirious. He doesn't know what he's doing. It was a lie, but it was the only one she could think of. The truth, that this was a gift of trust, was something Thorne would never comprehend. To him, it would only be a trick. Delirious or not, he's a danger, Thorne snarled. He gestured to his men. Take him to the stockade. The two troopers shifted, their expressions uneasy. They were simple soldiers, trained to follow orders, but there was a line. Questioning the fort nurse, a woman they all respected, was close to that line. They glanced from their captain to Alara, their rifles held uncertainly. You will do no such thing, Alara stated, her voice ringing with a command she didn't know she possessed. She looked past Thorne to the men behind him. This man is my patient. To move him now would be a death sentence. It'll be murder, and I will record it as such in my official medical log, which is sent to headquarters at Fort Lowell every month. I will name you Captain Thorne, and you, she said, her eyes finding each trooper in turn, as responsible for his death in direct violation of a medical order. The room was plunged into a thick, vibrating silence. Thorne's face had gone from pale to a mottled, furious red. The troopers looked terrified. An official report, a charge of murder against a superior officer. It was unthinkable, but the threat hung in the air, potent and real. She was playing a game she didn't fully understand, using rules of bureaucracy and regulation as weapons against a man who only respected the rule of force. Behind her, she heard a faint rustle of the straw-filled mattress. The Apache warrior was pushing himself up, leaning on one elbow. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes were clear and fiercely intelligent. They were fixed on Thorne, and the hatred was back, cold and pure. Then his gaze shifted to Alara, to the back of her head, and the expression softened almost imperceptibly. He had understood. He had heard her defense of him, her defiance. He had placed his trust in the right hands. Thorne seemed to feel the warrior's gaze on him. He turned slightly, a sneer twisting his lips. See? He's fine. Strong as a bull. He looked back at Alara. This is a military fort. Miss Finch, not a charity hospital. You've done your job. Now step aside. No, she said simply. The word, quiet but absolute, hung between them. It was a declaration of war. Thorne's hand tightened on the butt of his pistol. The air crackled. The two troopers braced themselves, their knuckles white on their rifles. The sun was higher now, streaming through the infirmary's single dusty window, illuminating the particles of dust dancing in the charged air. Alara's entire world had shrunk to this small room, to this confrontation. The life she had left behind in Philadelphia, the quiet, orderly existence she had fled, seemed a million miles away, a dream from another lifetime. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a guardian, and she would not be moved. The standoff held for a long, stretched moment, a tableau of competing wills. Thorne, embodying the fort's brutal mission, Alara, the unexpected bastion of its conscience, and the silent warrior on the cot, the cause and witness of it all. The captain's rage was a palpable thing, a heat shimmering off him. He was a man accustomed to instant obedience, and this small woman's defiance was an infuriating, incomprehensible obstacle. You are making a grave mistake, Miss Finch, he whispered, his voice low and venomous. You're choosing a savage over your own people. There are consequences for that. I am choosing my patient over a bully, Captain, she countered, her voice equally quiet but firm. And my duty over your impatience. There are consequences for that, too. They are called commendations. A muscle jumped in Thorne's jaw. He was being outmaneuvered, not by force, but by a logic he despised. He could physically remove her, of course. He could order his men to drag her out of the way. But the image of it, the story that would be told, manhandling the fort's beloved nurse to get to a wounded prisoner, it would not play well, not even in this rough-and-tumble outpost. Colonel Wallace valued order above all else. A public, messy incident would draw his ire far more than a delayed interrogation. He stared at her for another 10 seconds, his pale eyes searching for a crack in her resolve. He found none. What he saw was a cool, unyielding certainty that infuriated him all the more because he could not break it. With a final, disgusted exhalation of breath, he took a half-step back. "Fine," he spat, the word clipped and sharp. "Have it your way. Let him lie here and rot. But know this," he pointed a finger at her, the tip jabbing the air. "When he is fit, he is mine, and I will remember this. Every man in this fort will remember who you stood for today." He turned on his heel and stalked out, his troopers scrambling to follow, their relief almost comical. The sudden absence of his presence left a vacuum in the room, and Alara felt her knees go weak. The strength that had flooded her drained away, leaving her trembling. She leaned back against the edge of her small desk, taking a deep, shaky breath. The arrow was still in her hand, its sharp point having left a small, crescent-shaped indentation in her palm. She looked over the cot. The warrior had not lain back down. He was watching her, his expression unreadable but intense. The animosity was gone, replaced by a profound, questioning stillness. He had borne witness to her small, desperate battle on his behalf. For the first time, she felt he was seeing her, not a white uniform, not a representative of his enemies, but an individual. Slowly, she walked back to the cot, her legs unsteady. She stood before him, holding the arrow out on her open palm, offering it back. It was his, after all, his final, precious possession. He looked from the arrow to her face, then back again. He shook his head, a single, deliberate motion. He reached out, not to take the arrow, but to gently close her fingers around it. His touch was surprisingly light, his fingers dry and calloused against hers. It was a touch that lasted only a second, but it sent a jolt through her that was more powerful than Thorn's threats. He was refusing its return. The gift was absolute. He then spoke, his voice a low, rough rasp from disuse. The word was not in his own tongue. It was English. A single word, spoken with difficulty, but with utter clarity. Cale. It took her a moment to understand. It wasn't a request or a statement. It was an introduction. He was giving her his name. Cale. Alara, she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement. A name for a name, an arrow for a stand. The transaction was complete. He settled back onto the cot, his body clearly drained by the effort, and his eyes drifted shut. But it was not the stupor of fever that claimed him now. It was the rest of a man who had, against all odds, found an ally in the heart of the enemy's camp. Alara stood there for a long time, the silence of the infirmary settling around her. The morning bugle sounded outside, signaling the start of another day. But for her, the world had shifted on its axis. She was no longer just a nurse at Fort Grant. She was the keeper of an arrow and the protector of a man named Cale. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Captain Thorn would keep his promise. He would remember, and he would be back. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm, a bubble of peace inside a fortress humming with hostility. The world outside the infirmary walls was Thorn's. Alara felt it every time she stepped out for supplies or fresh air. The soldiers' gazes had changed. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a mixture of suspicion and a new, unsettling kind of interest. Whispers followed her like her own shadow. The Apache's nurse. Thorn says she's gone soft on him. She became an object of gossip, a curiosity, her defiance in the infirmary already hardening into fort legend. She ignored it, building the walls of her small clinic higher in her mind. Inside, there was only the patient and the nurse, the silence and the slow, arduous process of healing. Cale's fever broke on the second day. The angry redness around his wound began to recede, giving way to the healthy pink of new tissue. He was fighting the infection with the same silent, stoic endurance with which he had faced everything else. Their communication remained a thing of gestures and shared glances. Words were rare, but they were potent when they came. He would teach her the Apache word for water, too, when she brought him the dipper. She, in turn, would point to the bread and say its name, and he would repeat it, his pronunciation careful and measured. They built a small, fragile bridge of language between their two disparate worlds. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw that meant a surge of pain, the slight widening of his eyes that signaled curiosity. He, in turn, seemed to learn the rhythm of her movements, the gentle way she changed his dressings, the firmness in her hands that was meant to reassure. He began to accept food from her without hesitation, and one afternoon, when a spasm of pain shot through his side, he did not turn away to hide it, but met her eyes, a raw, unguarded acknowledgement of his own vulnerability. The arrow lay on her small desk, next to her medical journal. It was a constant presence, a reminder of the pact they had made. Sometimes she would pick it up, running her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the deadly perfection of its stone point. It was a symbol of his world, a world of survival, of hunting, of a connection to the land that the fort's inhabitants could never understand. They saw the land as something to be conquered, tamed. For him, she sensed, it was a part of his very being. Colonel Wallace visited once, his expression carefully neutral. He inspected her patient, nodded at the signs of recovery, and reviewed her medical log. "You've done well, Miss Finch," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "Continue your treatment. Let me know when he is fit for travel." It was a dismissal, a clear signal that while he had upheld her authority against Thorn, he would not involve himself further. She was on her own. The threat of Thorn was a constant, low-grade hum in the background. He did not return to the infirmary, but she felt his eyes on her whenever she was outside. He was waiting, biding his time, his patience that of a predator. She knew he was poisoning the well, turning the fort against her, framing her compassion as treason. One evening, a young trooper named Miller, a boy from Ohio with kind eyes, brought her a fresh bucket of water. He lingered at the door, twisting his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "you should be careful. The captain, he's been talking, telling the men that the Apache has you under some kind of spell. They are compromised." "Thank you for the warning, Private," Alara said, her voice betraying none of the cold fear that pricked her skin. "I'm a nurse doing my duty. The captain is a man looking for a promotion. I know which of those I trust more." The boy nodded, relieved, and scurried away. But his words lingered. Under some kind of spell. It was absurd, the talk of superstitious, uneducated men. And yet, there was a connection in that room that defied easy explanation. It wasn't a spell, but it was powerful. It was the simple, profound discovery of a shared humanity in a place dedicated to denying it. One afternoon, as she was re-bandaging his wound, Cale spoke, his voice still rough, but stronger now. "The soldier," he said, nodding towards the door. "He watches." "Thorn," she supplied. "He is the captain." Cale's eyes darkened. "He killed the boy." Alara paused, her hands still. "What boy?" "With us," Cale said, his words slow and chosen with effort. "Not a warrior. A boy. His first raid. Thorn wrote him down." Laughed. The memory brought a terrible, cold fire to Cale's eyes. It was the first time he had volunteered anything about the skirmish, and the fragment of story painted a picture of Thorn that was even blacker than she had imagined. He was not just a soldier. He was a man who took pleasure in cruelty. "I am sorry," she said, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. He looked at her, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. "You are not him," he said, a simple statement of fact that felt like absolution. As the days turned into a week, then two, Cale's strength returned. He was able to sit up on his own, then to stand, leaning against the wall for support. The hollows in his cheeks began to fill out. The stone-faced warrior was being replaced by the man he was meant to be, a man of quiet dignity and surprising gentleness. He showed her how to properly hold the arrow, how the fletching should rest against her cheek if she were to ever draw a bow. He explained, with a mixture of words and drawings etched with a piece of charcoal on a spare plank of wood, that the markings on the shaft told the story of its maker. It was not just a weapon, it was a biography. In turn, she read to him. At first, she did it for herself, to fill the long, quiet evenings. She read from the one book she had brought with her from Philadelphia, a worn volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. She did not think he would understand, but the sound of her voice seemed to soothe him. One night, as she was reading a passage from Hamlet, he stopped her. "He talks to his skull," Cale said, a statement, not a question. Alara looked up, surprised. "Yes, he is talking to the skull of his friend." Cale nodded slowly. "We do not do this. We let the spirits rest. To hold a man's bones is to hold his ghost. This man, Hamlet, is haunted." She stared at him, stunned. He had not just been listening to the sounds. He had been understanding the story, processing its themes through the lens of his own culture. He saw the core of the tragedy with a clarity that had escaped her. The play was not just about revenge. It was about being trapped by the past, by the ghosts of what has been lost. In that moment, the infirmary felt less like a prison and more like a university, a place of profound and unexpected learning. The bubble of their strange peace was bound to burst. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after he had been brought in. Colonel Wallace appeared at the door, his face grim. Captain Thorne stood just behind him, a look of smug triumph on his face. "Miss Finch," the colonel began, his tone formal and distant. "I've just received your latest report. You've declared prisoner Cale fit for travel." Alara's heart sank. She had known this day was coming. She had written the report herself, her hand heavy as she penned the words. Medically, he was healed. The wound was closed, the danger of infection past. To keep him longer would be a lie, a direct insubordination she could not afford. "Yes, Colonel," she said, her voice tight. "He is excellent," Thorne cut in, stepping forward. "Then he's my prisoner again. We have a wagon leaving for the territorial prison at Yuma at dawn. He'll be on it." Yuma. The name was a death sentence, a sun-scorched hellhole from which few prisoners, white or native, ever returned. It was a place of hard labor and casual brutality, a place designed to break men's bodies and spirits. Alara looked at Cale. He had risen from the cot and was standing tall, his face impassive, but she could see the tension in the muscles of his shoulders, the dark knowledge in his eyes. He had known this was the inevitable end. Their time together was just a brief, stolen reprieve. "He will need provisions for the journey," she said, her mind racing, searching for any way to delay, to fight. "Medical supplies, water, that will all be taken care of," Thorne said dismissively. He gestured to the 2 guards with him. "Secure the prisoner." The guards moved forward, but Cale held up a hand. He would not be manhandled. He walked towards them, his steps steady and proud. He was a warrior again, surrendering on his own terms. As they placed irons on his wrists, he looked over their shoulders at Alara. There was no fear in his eyes, no pleading. There was only a quiet, profound farewell. Thorne grinned, his victory complete. "Thank you for your services, nurse. You've been most helpful." He turned to leave, his prize now firmly in his grasp. As they led Cale out into the harsh afternoon sun, Alara felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. She had failed. She had healed him only to deliver him to a slower, more agonizing death. All her defiance, all her small victories had amounted to nothing. She had only postponed the inevitable. She walked to her desk, her movements stiff and robotic. Her eyes fell upon the arrow. It was all she had left of him, a symbol of a trust that she had been powerless to honor. A hot, angry tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She had lost. Thorne had won. The world was as cruel and unjust as she had always feared. But as she picked up the arrow, its familiar weight in her palm, a new feeling began to burn through the despair. It was not resignation. It was rage. A cold, clear, calculating rage. Thorne thought he had won. The colonel thought the matter was closed. They were wrong. The the story was not over yet. They had forgotten one crucial detail. They had forgotten who she was. She was not just a nurse. She was the daughter of Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who had taught her that the most important tool in healing was not the scalpel or the suture, but a relentless, stubborn refusal to give up. And she was not done fighting for Cale. Not yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur of calculated action. Alara's grief and rage coalesced into a sharp, singular focus. Thorn believed he had won by following the rules. She would beat him by using rules he had forgotten existed. Her father had not only been a surgeon. He had been a contract physician for the army during the war, a man who understood its labyrinthine bureaucracy better than most generals. He had drilled into her the importance of regulations, not just as guidelines, but as weapons. She locked the infirmary door and pulled out her medical journal. She didn't turn her notes on Cale's healing, but to the front pages, where she had copied out key passages from the Army Medical Department's 1861 manual, her Bible in this wilderness. She scanned the dense text, her finger tracing the lines, searching for the loophole, the one obscure regulation that Thorn, in his arrogance, would have overlooked. And then she found it. Section 14, Article 3. Transportation of prisoners with recent major injury. It stated, in dry, bureaucratic language, that any prisoner who had undergone significant trauma, even if deemed fit for travel, required a signed medical waiver from the treating physician detailing the specific risks of the journey. Furthermore, if the destination was known for extreme environmental conditions, and Yuma was the very definition of that, the physician was required to provide a detailed list of necessary medical provisions and to personally inspect said provisions before departure. Without that signed waiver and inspection, the transporting officer would be held solely responsible for any decline in the prisoner's health. It was a small thing, a piece of red tape, but in the hands of a determined woman, it was a crowbar. Her next stop was the quartermaster's stores. She marched in, her logbook under her arm, and presented Sergeant Phillips, a portly man who oversaw the fort supplies, with a list. It was a long list. She demanded quinine for potential fever, clean linen for bandages, not the filthy rags they usually used. She demanded a full cask of fresh water, not the alkali-laced stuff from the regular barrels. She demanded salted meat and hardtack, enough for 10 days, citing the risk of malnutrition on a healing body. She demanded a thick wool blanket to protect against the cold desert nights. The sergeant blanched. "Miss Finch, this is enough for a patrol. Not one prisoner. Captain Thorn will have my hide." "Captain Thorn is not a doctor," Alara said coolly, tapping the regulation she had bookmarked in her manual. "This is what is required by Army regulation. If you refuse to provide these items, I will note your name and your refusal in my official report. Colonel Wallace can sort it out. I'm sure he'd be fascinated to learn his quartermaster is ignoring medical directives." Sergeant Phillips, a man who feared paperwork more than an Apache raid, paled and began to grumble as he filled her order. She stood over him, watching his every move, ensuring he gave her the best of what little they had. Her final preparation was the waiver itself. She spent an hour composing it, her pen scratching across the paper. She detailed the nature of Cale's bullet wound, the risk of internal tearing from the jostling of the wagon, the danger of dehydration, the possibility of the infection returning under stress. She painted a grim picture, all of it medically accurate, all of it designed to be a bureaucratic landmine. The document ended with a simple, clear line. "I, Nurse Alara Finch, have inspected the provisions and find them barely adequate. I sign this waiver under protest and absolve myself of any responsibility should the prisoner's condition deteriorate due to the rigors of this ill-advised and hasty transport." Armed with her list, her supplies, and her carefully worded document, she felt a sliver of hope. It was a fragile, desperate hope, but it was better than the crushing despair she had felt hours earlier. She wasn't trying to free Cale. She knew that was impossible. She was trying to give him a fighting chance. She was trying to honor the trust he had placed in her. As dusk settled over the fort, She saw them moving Cale from the temporary holding cell to the wagon that was being prepared near the main gate. He was still in irons, his face a stoic mask, but he walked with his head held high. Thorn was there, overseeing the preparations, barking orders, a man savoring his victory. Alara took a deep breath and marched across the parade ground, her white uniform stark in the fading light. She felt every eye in the fort on her. The whispers started again, but she ignored them. She walked straight up to Captain Thorn. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying in the evening air, "I need to inspect the prisoner's provisions before you depart." Thorn turned, an amused smirk on his face. "Really, nurse? I think we have it handled." "It's not a request," Alara said, holding up her logbook. "It's a regulation. Section 14, Article 3. I also have a waiver for you to sign, acknowledging the medical risks." Thorn's smirk faltered. He clearly had no idea what she was talking about. He snatched the logbook from her and read the passage she had marked. His face darkened as he read, a slow, creeping flush of anger rising from his collar. He saw the trap. "This is ridiculous," he snarled. "It's preposterous." "It's the rules, Captain," Alara said sweetly. "Something Colonel Wallace is very fond of. Now, if you'll show me the supplies." Fuming, Thorn gestured to a small, pathetic bundle thrown into the back of the wagon. It contained a single water skin and a piece of dry jerky. Alara shook her head. "Unacceptable." She turned and signaled to Private Miller, who she had conscripted to help her. He and another nervous-looking trooper came forward, hauling the cask of water and the crate of supplies she had procured from the quartermaster. "These are the required provisions," she announced. "Load them onto the wagon." Thorn looked as if he was about to explode. The guards, the wagon driver, even the other soldiers lounging nearby were watching this public confrontation with wide-eyed fascination. The fort nurse was dressing down the fiercest officer on the post, using his own rulebook against him. "You are exceeding your authority, Miss Finch," he seethed. "No, Captain, I am exercising it precisely," she replied, her calm infuriating him further. She held out the waiver and a pen. "Now, if you would be so kind as to sign here, acknowledging the risks and confirming that I have provided the necessary supplies." He stared at the paper as if it were a snake. To sign it was to admit her authority, to acknowledge that she had outmaneuvered him. To refuse to sign, it would be to flagrantly violate a regulation she could, and would, take directly to the colonel. He was caught. With a muttered curse, he snatched the pen and scribbled his name, his signature a furious, illegible slash. He shoved the paper back at her. "Are you satisfied?" "Almost," she said. She walked to the back of the wagon where Cale was now sitting, his back against the wooden siding. His eyes were on her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in their dark depths. Not hope, perhaps, but a deep, burning curiosity. He had no idea what the papers and the arguments were about, but he knew she was fighting for him. She addressed the driver, a grizzled old corporal. "This man's blanket. Where is it?" The driver shrugged. "Ain't got one for him." Alara turned a cold gaze on Thorn. "A wool blanket was on the list, Captain. The nights in the high desert can drop below freezing. To deny him one is tantamount to torture." Thorn threw his hands up in exasperation. "For God's sake, give him a blanket," he yelled at the driver. The driver rummaged around and produced a thin, threadbare blanket riddled with holes. Alara took it, her expression one of utter disdain. She walked back to her infirmary without another word, returning moments later with her own thick, warm wool blanket, the one she kept on her own cot. She handed it to Cale. He looked at the blanket, then at her, a question in his eyes. "The nights are cold," she said softly, for his ears only. He took the blanket, his chained fingers brushing against hers. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a thank you, a recognition, and a farewell, all in one. Alara stepped back from the wagon, her work done. She had not saved him, but she had given him armor. She had given him water, food, and warmth. She had used the army's own cold logic to force a moment of humanity. She had lost the war, but she had won this final, crucial battle. Thorn, his face a thundercloud, barked an order. Move out. The driver cracked his whip, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels groaning as it began the slow journey towards the main gate and the vast, dangerous wilderness beyond. Alara stood her ground, watching it go. She watched until the wagon was just a dark shape against the deepening twilight. She stood there long after it had disappeared, the dust settling back onto the quiet parade ground. She had done all she could. Now he was on his own. Sleep did not come that night. Alara lay on her cot, the thin army-issue blanket a poor substitute for her own, which was now warming Kale somewhere out in the dark desert. Every sound from outside, the changing of the guard, the distant howl of a coyote, the wind whistling through the cracks in the timber, seemed magnified, ominous. She had played her hand, and now all that was left was the waiting. She thought of Kale, chained in the back of that jolting wagon. She imagined his stoicism, his silent endurance. She had armed him with supplies, but it felt like so little against the vastness of the desert and the cruelty of the men who held him captive. The image of the Yuma prison, a place she had only heard described in grim whispers, loomed in her mind. Her confrontation with Thorn had left an unsettling quiet over the fort. She had won, publicly, and a man like Thorn would not forgive such a humiliation. He would be looking for any excuse to retaliate, to reassert his dominance. She had made herself a target. The thought should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm, the peace that comes after a battle well fought, regardless of the outcome. Just before dawn, a new sound cut through the quiet. It was the frantic, rhythmic thud of a horse being ridden hard, coming not from the wilderness, but from the west, along the main trail. It was an unusual time for an arrival. Alara sat up, her senses on high alert. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until they stopped abruptly near the colonel's quarters. There was shouting, urgent voices cutting through the pre-dawn chill. A knot of ice formed in Alara's stomach. Something was wrong. She quickly dressed and stepped outside. A small crowd of soldiers was gathering on the parade ground, their faces pale and anxious in the gray light. Colonel Wallace was there, still in his nightshirt, his face grim as he listened to a dust-caked scout who had just dismounted from a lathered horse. Captain Thorn pushed his way to the front of the group, his expression a mixture of excitement and aggression. Alara edged closer, trying to hear what was being said over the rising murmur of the men. "A war party, Colonel," the scout was saying, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "A big one. Looks like Cochise's own band, joined up with others. They hit the supply depot at Apache Pass. Wiped it out. They're riding this way now. Seems they're looking for something. Or someone." Thorn's eyes lit up with a feral gleam. "It's him," he said, his voice ringing with certainty. "They're coming for the prisoner." The colonel's face went ashen. "How many?" 50, 60 riders, maybe more," the scout replied. "Armed with rifles, not just bows. They'll be here by mid-morning." A wave of fear washed over the assembled soldiers. Fort Grant was a small outpost, its garrison depleted by patrols. A force of that size, armed and determined, was not a raiding party. It was an army. Thorn seized the opportunity. "We need to prepare a defense, Colonel, and we need to make a point. We can't let them think they can intimidate us. We should hang the prisoner from the gatehouse. Let it be the first thing they see when they arrive." A murmur of agreement went through some of the men. It was a brutal, savage idea, but in their fear, it made a certain kind of sense. A message of defiance. "No," Colonel Wallace said, his voice shaking but firm. "We will not resort to barbarism, Captain. That is not how this army operates." He turned to a lieutenant. "Sound the general quarters. Get every man on the walls. Double the ammunition." Thorn was furious. "Sir, a show of force is the only thing they understand, and a show of discipline is what I command." Wallace shot back, his authority reasserting itself. "Now follow your orders." Thorn stormed off, his face a mask of rage, shouting at his men to get to their posts. The fort exploded into a frenzy of organized chaos. Men ran for the palisade walls, rifles in hand. The heavy main gate was barred, the blacksmith's forge roaring to life to heat shot. The air which had been still and quiet moments before, was now thick with tension and the metallic taste of impending battle. Alara stood frozen in the midst of the turmoil. A war party, coming for Cale. The thought was staggering. He was not just a warrior, he was important. Important enough for a force of that size to risk a direct assault on a U.S. Army fort. She had known he was a man of dignity and strength, but she had not grasped the full measure of his stature among his people. Her first thought was for him. He was no longer in the fort. He was out there, somewhere on the trail to Yuma, chained and helpless in the back of that wagon, caught between the army he was fleeing and the people who were coming to save him. The wagon was a slow, lumbering target. It stood no chance. And then a second, colder thought struck her. Captain Thorne. He knew the wagon was out there. In his rage and frustration, what would he do? He couldn't hang Cale from the gatehouse, but there were other ways to send a message. A small, fast-moving patrol could intercept the wagon long before the main Apache force arrived. Thorne could kill Cale out in the desert, far from the colonel's oversight, and claim he was killed while trying to escape. It would be his word against a dead man's. He would get his revenge on Cale, and on her, in one swift, brutal act. She had to warn them. She had to do something. Without a second thought, she ran. Not to the colonel, who was overwhelmed with the fort's defense, but to the stables. The stable master, a grizzled old man named Silas, looked at her in astonishment as she burst in. "I need a horse, Silas," she said, her voice breathless. "The fastest one you have." "Miss Finch, what in blazes are you thinking? The whole Apache nation is about to come down on us. That's why I have to go," she said, her eyes pleading. "There's a wagon out there. A prisoner. They won't stand a chance." "You're crazy," he said, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He, too, had witnessed her stand against Thorne. "Thorne will have you shot for a deserter." "Only if he catches me," she replied. She saw the conflict on his face, duty warring with sympathy. After a long moment, he let out a sigh of defeat. He pointed to a lean, wiry Mustang in the far stall. "That's Bess," he said. "She's got a mean temper, but she's faster than anything Thorne rides. Take her, and God help you, child." While Silas quickly threw a saddle on the mare, Alara ran back to the infirmary. She grabbed a small satchel, stuffing it with bandages, a flask of water, and the one thing that mattered most, the arrow. She tucked it carefully inside, a talisman against the dangers ahead. When she returned to the stables, Silas had the horse ready. He helped her mount, his old hand surprisingly gentle. "Ride west, then cut south through the arroyo," he whispered. "It'll shave an hour off the main trail. It's rough going, but it's your only chance of getting ahead of anyone Thorne might send." "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. She nudged the horse with her heels, and the mare shot out of the stables and across the chaotic parade ground. She saw Thorne's head whip around, his eyes widening in disbelief and fury as he saw her riding for the small sally port on the western wall, which was not yet barred. He shouted her name, a raw, angry sound that was swallowed by the din of the fort. She didn't look back. She galloped through the opening and out into the vast, empty landscape, the rising sun at her back. She was no longer a nurse, no longer a resident of Fort Grant. She was a lone rider on a stolen horse, with a stolen arrow, riding into the heart of a war zone. She was riding to save the life of a man who had, with one silent gesture, entrusted his own to her. The gate was blocked behind her, but the world was wide open ahead, and somewhere in it, Cale was waiting.